Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the American Ethnostate. And this is a fairly lengthy presentation that I've put together on some of the aspects of us reestablishing country borders that you may not be aware of. Now, it's all well and good to divide a country among ethnic lines. However, I think that when you talk about this only on demographics, you are neutering yourself in some ways. But not only am I going to go through the demographic argument, we're going to look at resource maps, things we might need to consider when going forward with the concept of a potential split up of the United States, a sort of balkanization. And then at the end, I will give you my thoughts on the optimal split up of the United States. So, first thing we have here, this is a very detailed 2010 census block. Each blue dot is a one white person, each green dot is one black person, and each red dot is an Asian person, orange, Hispanic, and then brown, other, multi, or Native American. And you can see very clearly where people have sort of semi-segregated themselves already. So when I go through a slide, keep it in the back of your mind because I've taken a look at all of these, combined them all together, and really thought about how the United States should be split up if we were in an optimal environment. And I think that's one thing that is very important, is to keep in mind this is all optimistic. This is not taking into account any civil war or environmental disasters or anything like that. This is purely from a theoretical and strategic standpoint. So here we have our first demographic map. Now we have a county map that shows minority overrepresentation. Essentially, each county that has an overrepresentation or a larger population than is the standard for this minority population in the United States. So clearly we can tell from this where the majority of non-whites live in the United States, broken down by county. If you want to go ahead and pause the video while I'm doing these slides so you can review it, go right ahead. Now again, we have a very similar overrepresentation map. These counties are shown according to which races have a population greater than the national average in that county. Counties in which more than one race has a population greater than the national average are shown as multi-ethnic. So again, the same kind of segregation themes persist. And now we have a basic breakdown of white versus non-white maps, broken down by county once again. And each of these counties is represented as above 79.6% white and below 79.6% white. So some counties who are right at 78%, what's the difference between 78 and 80%? It's kind of in an ambiguous range, but you can really get a feel for which counties are majority white as what you would consider in an ethnostate of some kind, which is above 80 to 90% of one ethnic group. Now, let's look at the black population of the United States. Clearly, we can see a trend here. The dark blue areas represent 50 to 86% black American, and it devolves kind of from that. So we want to get a feel for where the dominant areas are for each of the non-white ethnic groups in the United States are, if we're going to divide up the country into various little ethnostates as well. And you can see, of course, it's, as we would expect, in the southern United States, reaching all the way up into Virginia. Now, we also have to look at the Hispanic populations as well. And you can very clearly see that the Hispanic populations group in the western areas on the border countries to Mexico. And this is not a surprise, of course, but if you were curious about how the rest of the United States looks, well, here you go. Now, here is the percentage of infants under age 1 who are non-white. This is, again, pretty much a combination of the last two maps that we've looked at, broken down by county, and this is 2010 census data, and the same type of patterns remain true here. It's usually the southern United States. We have in the west, we have Hispanic, and then as we go further east, we run into black Americans. Now, this is a slightly harder one for me to find, so the quality is quite low. I apologize. This is an Asian population map from the 2010 census. Each green dot is 3,000 residents, and you can see that there Asian Americans mainly cluster in the large cities. Very few of them are just out and about, spread around the United States. Again, they cluster very heavily on the coast, as should be expected. This is where the major population centers are. Now, here's a post-millennial study. This is the minority share of state populations in 2015, according to the millennial generation. So essentially the up-and-coming generations, this is a demographic breakdown map of that. And this is from the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. And again, the same pattern sort of persists. There is an anomaly in the northeastern United States, I believe, with Jewish people and Chinese. I think it's broadly Asian, where this sort of New York State is rather dark. And this is an interesting one. This is just an ancestry map from the year 2000, and this breaks down white American ancestries as well. In case, if you really wanted to get autistic about it, you could break down each individual white population by their heritage, but I'm not going to do that. I think that's a purity spiral on a whole nother level. But again, we see the same sort of trends here, where the southern United States is populated mostly by non-whites. And just for consistency's sake, we can look at Spanish speakers as well to further solidify the population centers for Hispanic persons. Now here's an interesting one that you might not have thought about. Here's a percent of households with kids that are headed by a married couple in the year 2000. It's a little bit out of date, but I assume things haven't changed too much from then. We have yet to see any great cultural shifts from them, but if you look, a fledgling nation, if we're reorganizing borders, a fledgling nation cannot be made up of people who come from broken homes. It's not going to work very well. So if we can try to avoid this, that would be very good. Okay, now we have population density. If you're curious about what the major population centers of the United States are, you can see this here. Bear in mind that this will play a large portion to later parts of the video where we'll talk more about the economy and things like that. So just keep this in mind, but this has to do with demographics as well. Here's another one that some people don't seem to think about, and that's the percent of a county's residents over age 65. Now you have to keep in mind, with a fledgling nation that's just reforming, with a new economic structure, all of those good things that we want, we cannot have a whole bunch of social systems, security systems in place, because the country is just going to be reforming. It's going to take some time before we put these things into place, before we have a certified tax code and legal system and all of these things. The social welfare programs kind of have to take a back seat. So someone is going to have to take care of the extremely elderly, and we can see that most elderly people are right down the middle of the United States and in Florida. Something to keep in mind. Now, here's one that, again, I don't see a whole lot of talk of, and it's not as important as demographics, but this is a religious demographic breakdown of the United States, because you have to keep in mind, you cannot really have multiple competing faiths in a country if you want the maximum amount of unity. Now, some of the breakdown of Protestant faiths is kind of unimportant because they all fall under Protestantism. Catholicism is a little bit more antagonistic to that. Of course, we see here there's a large segment of the population that's Southern Baptist, and we have the Latter-day Saints or Mormon section carved out here in the West, and that will come into play when I give you my thoughts on the breakdown later. But something to keep in mind is this religious breakdown of the country. This is going to be important going forward, because one of the primary issues of our times of the past couple of decades has been the separation between church and state. And you can say whatever you want about or whatever your opinion may be about the separation of church and state, but regardless, you're going to have to deal with religious folks who care very much about their faith. Here's another one, largest participating religious group by county. Again, it's the exact same trend, more or less. So over this 10-year period, we can kind of interpret that as there not being a whole lot of religious movement in the country. Maybe a little bit more on the Mormon side. Yeah, I would say definitely a little bit more movement on the Mormon side. Now here's the percent of reported religious adherents. This is the amount of religious followers. So if you're going to establish a state, you have to be careful of this. If you're presiding over a group of religious fundamentalists, you have to keep that in mind, because they are more than likely not going to want to be ruled over someone who is not of that faith, or especially not someone who is non-religious. And again, on that note, you have to keep in mind, this is what I was just saying, the religious adherence by county. If you're residing over a county that's 100% religious, you might want to keep that in mind. And here's, just for the sake of it, a religious diversity index to see exactly how diverse religiously a county is. This is using Simpson's diversity index. Now, let's get into the actual physical land itself. We're moving away from demographics just a bit. Here's I think, the more important section. And I think you'll begin to see why this is so important once I get into it. But here's a topographical relief map of the United States for those who are unaware. Something to keep in mind, as I've said before. Now, long-term agroecosystem research sites and farm resource regions. This is a breakdown of the different farming environments that the United States has, and many of the primary areas of farming activity represented by the dots here. And you can kind of get an idea of how the United States is broken up agriculturally, or along ecosystem lines here. So if you're going to reestablish your borders, you have to keep in mind that you're going to need certain ecosystems to survive off of. So, for example, if you were to just take the Northern Plains region, you might miss out on some resources from the Southern Plains, or from the river basins, sort of the Nile of the Americas through the Mississippi River. Here's something very important, and we're going to talk about cropland just a little bit. These are the acres of cropland fertilized, excluding cropland pastured, as percent of all cropland acreage of 2007. So we're looking at all fertilized cropland. You have to keep in mind that if you're having a state, you got to feed them. You got to have food, otherwise your population is going to revolt. So if you don't have adequate enough farmland, you're not going to be able to feed anybody without having to import a lot of food. Now, the whole purpose of a lot of this is to be self-reliant. And if you're not self-reliant, you're not self-reliant if you can't grow and maintain your own food supply. On a similar note, we could also look at the acres of irrigated land as a percentage of land and farms acreage. Again, 2007, same source, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Something to keep in mind, the difference between fertilized and irrigated land. Most of it in the United States is in the west, although there's this river basin in the central there, along the Mississippi. Now, you also need to take into account that there's different types of croplands. Different people have pastures and animals. You have different types of crops. And we're just looking here at major land use types: croplands, forest, grassland, and then special uses. So, for example, Texas has more cropland and more grassland than something like Maine, which is majority forest with a little bit of special use land thrown in there. So you have to keep in mind, okay, what type of food are we going to grow? How are we going to sustain ourselves? Do we have enough irrigated and enough fertilized land to grow crops? Are we going to rely heavily on the agricultural industry or the industrial power, such as mining, things like that? Something to keep in mind. And again, here we're looking at soil conditions, and this is a drought monitor for 2011. We also can look at topsoil moisture, adequate and surplus, pure surplus, just adequate, and a topsoil shortage, and a very much shortage here. It goes from a top down to the green and then over to the red. But we can see what areas have adequate or a surplus of topsoil moisture, which is important for sustaining the ecosystem therein. And if you're going to take over an area that is prone to droughts, you have to focus on supplying water to your citizenry. Otherwise, they're going to all die out, or you'll have to import it, or you'll have to find out a way to desalinate seawater or something like that if you're living on the coast. It's much easier to just have access to aqueducts or not aqueducts, reservoirs or something like that, and you have to be able to manage your ecosystem. One thing you're going to have to keep in mind when you're establishing a new state is you're going to need all of these committees and little government bodies in order to manage all of these things, because one person cannot possibly manage all of this information all at once. So when you're establishing your state, you're going to need a department of this and a department of that and a department of these and all of these different things. So keep all of this in mind. Now here we have just a general resource map, sort of where things come from of the United States. I apologize, the quality is a little bit low, but I couldn't find the original image. And now we're looking at coal, natural gas, oil, forest, gold, silver, iron, uranium, bauxite, other minerals, fishing, and major manufacturing and trade centers. And you can see exactly where different materials are coming from. And this is the important thing about realigning borders. You cannot neuter yourself economically. Whether or not you're just trying to survive and set up your own little homeland, you're not going to be able to prosper if you do not have the resources to engage in the modern economy. So you don't want to cut yourself off. Best bet is that you're going to sit down at the the peace talks or the table with the other ethnic groups that are trying to divide up the nation. You're going to say, okay, we want this, and you're going to negotiate for certain resources. And this is very important, because you can go out into the backwoods all you want to, but you're not going to maintain an industrial economy of any scale if you don't focus on things like this when you go to the table. Again, here's a natural and industrial resource map showing land usage. I know it's kind of hard to see. We have different resource markers here and different land usages. And you can see, I believe the yellow is cropland. Very important, like I said. The brown, I believe, is mining and industrial uses. But regardless, again, this is something you have to take into account when you're reestablishing borders, is that you don't want to cut yourself off from the economy. Again, we're trying to be self-sufficient here. Here's a mining map broken down by county, and the location quotients by county and the 2001 employment. And you can kind of see where minerals and mining operations are the most prevalent, because you will need to start pulling things out of the ground, especially if you want a steel industry, if you want copper, gold, if you're going to produce electronics, things like this. You're going to need certain materials. Now we have to talk about energy as well. Federal lands and oil and gas fields. So if you plan on having natural gas or oil or rely on this, I know we're trying to shift towards more renewable sources, but I believe for the next 100 years, we're still going to be heavily reliant on these unrenewable resources. So you have to keep in mind that you're going to need some of these materials if you want to stay competitive on a global market. Don't give up too much if you're sitting down and negotiating with other groups. And here's an oil and natural gas production map. You can kind of see the breakdown of oil production, gas production, mixed productions, and dry wells. Now here's a shale map. Kind of zoom in here, it's like a big advertisement. Basin, tight sand, and shale play. You can kind of see where all of these energy markers are here. And let's go to, yes, geothermal resources. Just something to throw in there in case some people are curious about potential areas for geothermal energy extraction, things like that. You can kind of see where everything clusters on the west. A lot of mining and oil and gas and things like that, basically, center around the Midwest and all the way over to the west coast. And here's a tech industry map. This one's very important if you plan on having a high-tech society. You have to look at what places are the tech centers of the world. We've got IT, automotive, aerospace, chemicals, plastics, electrical, and biopharma areas. And of course, most of these are centered around large population centers in major cities. So you definitely don't want to leave yourself out of this cut of the pie. So if you were to, for example, just take Montana, you would have none of this high-tech industry to work with. Could you establish it? Perhaps, yes, absolutely. But on the negotiating table, you don't want to give up too much. You need to stand up for yourself and take what you need to take. Now here's an industry. I believe it's a major industry region map broken down by county, so you can see food services, agriculture, arts, construction, educational, whatever the dominant industry is, broken down by county. So if you were, for example, to take over, I don't know, Missouri here, and you have to see, okay, which part of the economy is propping up our nation? Well, for here it would be manufacturing, so you have to be very good to your manufacturing base. If you're in Florida, you have to focus on retail, things like that. Now again, if we're establishing a new state, obviously we're going to have economic advisors, but if you're talking about realigning borders, you have to keep this in mind as to what is optimal. And here we have energy production. This one is super important in modern day life. You have to produce enough electricity and other sources of energy as well in order to meet the needs of your population. So, of course, now Texas has its own power grid. The rest of the United States is not quite as independent, but here you can see the different sources of energy. On the West Coast, and especially in the Northwest, you have a high reliance on hydro and a little bit of natural gas. As you move east, you start to use more and more coal. So if you plan on establishing a new state in, Ohio, and you banned coal usage for energy, you're going to run into maybe some problems because a lot of people rely on coal. And again, as it stands right now, if you were to take one of the more remote states for yourself, you would be at a loss of energy production probably for some time. It would require a much larger buildup of infrastructure in order to accommodate a new burgeoning society. And here, this is an interesting one. We have United States economic activity split in half. So the richest areas, or not maybe richest, but the places that have the most economic activity split apart from areas that have the least economic activity in a 50-50 split. So again, if you care a lot about the economy and industry and maintaining your nation and being prosperous, you can't just cut out a little section here in the middle where there's hardly any economic activity. It's going to take a lot of time and energy and resources to build that area up. Now, another key thing here is that when you're establishing a nation, one of the most important things that you can get is access to open waters, the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans. Again, if you were to establish a new state in the very center of the United States, not only would you be surrounded on all sides by potential adversaries, but you would be cutting yourself off from international trade along waters. And here are the various metropolitan areas of the United States. If you're looking for information on various large population centers, I guess you could call them. And here is an interesting one. These are the major airport centers of the United States. So you have to think about travel and airports. If you don't have them in your new state, it's something you have to build. It's just more effort that you have to put in. Now here is one where a lot of people are going to get into conflicts about. Now, let's say that the United States federal government does break up or something like that, and you have to sit down and divide up all of the old federal government resources. Well, one of those is going to be military equipment. So if you put yourself in a place where there's no military equipment, you're going to have to either make it or steal it or secure it or trade for it or somehow. So if you give everybody else all of this military equipment, they're going to be at an immediate advantage over you. This military hardware, regardless of whether or not the groups can make use of it, they will find a way. Either that or they'll trade it away in order to make money. Now, let's get to my personal thoughts on this. So, I know this is a rather crude drawing, but this is just a basic overview of some of my thoughts. There are 4 major areas of contention if we're talking about balkanizing the United States. What I've outlined in red, I believe, at my current opinions in the here and now, this would be the optimal space for white Americans to live. It includes a lot of industry, a lot of resources, access to open waters, plenty of empty space, plenty of farmland, plenty of energy production, all these various things, plenty of routes of trade, plenty of airports, plenty of military equipment left over, plenty of military bases, things like this. And now it's quite large, and there's going to be some contention on what the exact borders are, but if you factor in all of the things that we've just talked about, this, to me, in my analysis, appears to be the best possible solution. But let's talk about the other ones. Now, the ones outlined in blue, the little area I have outlined in blue here, the southern United States, this is an area that I would put as sort of the black American ethnostate, the place where they are already the majority of the population in most of the counties, someplace where all black Americans spread out throughout the United States would be welcome and encouraged to move to. And it makes sense because it's the least amount of people that you have to displace. It's not like you really wouldn't want to establish a white ethnostate in the backwoods of Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia, not in Atlanta or anything like that. It's going to cause too many issues. So when we're sitting down at the negotiating table, this would be my a suggestion to the opposite side. Is like, hey, you're already a majority here, just take it, we don't want it. Now, there are some radical breakup of borders that don't exactly cross state lines. And those are just little minor things that I think might improve the situation. Now, in Texas, you have a demographic split between Hispanics and blacks. And as I've talked about previously, there are a lot of disagreements between the Hispanic and black communities. So I think this is an amicable split between the two. Now, the green section is an interesting one. Why? Is this the Hispanic ethnostate? No, this is a United States of America Part 2 electric boogaloo. These are the free states that or the free area, I should say, that I don't give a shit about. If you want to live there, if it wants to be multicultural, if it wants to be a liberal democracy, I say let them have it. If you don't want to live in either of the 2 other ethnostates, you can live in the green area all you want to. Don't care, just take it. Now, an interesting one, and it's a point that I think matters quite a bit, is the purple section here. And you might be wondering, what could possibly be in the purple area? And this, to me, is the Mormon containment zone. This is where I want all of the Latter-day Saints to just stay over there. They can govern themselves. And this is really a matter of pragmatism, because my personal thought is I see Mormonism as a religious cult. It's a bastardization of Christianity. It can stay in its own little containment area within its own little borders. They can rule themselves all they want to. Now, regardless of what their ethnicities are or anything like that, I don't want them in my state because they're a particular type of religion that I don't want to interact with. They're ungovernable except for other Mormons, and as far as I'm concerned, they can just stay where they are. This outline that I've made in purple is the majority of where these people are. Just let them stay there. They can rule themselves. And if they want to, they can remain in the United States of America Part 2 if they want to, or they can secede and be their own little state, all they want to, the Mormon States of America. Who cares? Let them live on their own. But I'm curious to what everyone else's thoughts are on this little presentation that I've put together here. Do you think that some of the borders are right, some of them are wrong? Do you think this is, regardless of the technical aspect of getting to this point, if we're talking about lofty goals and abstract ideas, do you think that my breakdown is a viable solution? Is it way crazy? Are there any other aspects of reorganizing borders that you think that we should focus on, please leave me a comment down below, or you can find me on Twitter or on the Discord link. Thanks for watching.